HOA illegally sold black man's 1,500 acres of land. Then so he legally sold their homes. Marcus Washington stood on the front porch of his grandfather's old farmhouse, staring at the eviction notice that had been nailed to his front door. The 78-year-old retired professor couldn't believe what he was reading. The Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association claimed they had legally purchased his 1,500 acres of family land through a tax sale, and they were demanding that he vacate the property within 30 days. The land had been in Marcus's family for over a century, passed down from his great-grandfather who had purchased it in 1923 with money saved from working in the steel mills of Pittsburgh. Through segregation, economic hardship, and decades of attempts by white neighbors to force the family to sell, the Washington family had held onto their ancestral property with fierce determination. Marcus had inherited the land 15 years earlier when his father passed away, and he had been living quietly in the old farmhouse, tending a small vegetable garden and enjoying his retirement after 40 years as a history professor at the local community college. He paid his property taxes faithfully every year, maintained the property meticulously, and had never received any legal notices about problems with his ownership. But now, according to the Riverside Meadows HOA, his family's century-old claim to the land was invalid, and they had somehow legally acquired the property through what they claimed was a legitimate tax sale. The notice was signed by HOA President Karen Whitman, a woman Marcus had never met but whose reputation for aggressive legal tactics was well known throughout the county. What the HOA didn't know was that Marcus Washington wasn't just any retired professor. He had spent 4 decades teaching constitutional law and property rights, had authored 3 books on land ownership disputes, and had successfully argued cases before the state Supreme Court. More importantly, he had been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of attack on his family's property rights for over 20 years. Karen Whitman and the Riverside Meadows HOA were about to learn that they had picked the wrong black man to steal from, and that Professor Marcus Washington had legal weapons at his disposal that would not only restore his property rights, but would also cost them everything they owned. The Riverside Meadows development had been built 15 years earlier on land adjacent to Marcus Washington's family property. The upscale subdivision featured 200 custom homes, each valued between $800,000 and $1.2 million, and attracted wealthy professionals who wanted the prestige of rural living with urban amenities. The HOA was known for its strict rules, high fees, and aggressive enforcement of property standards. From the beginning, there had been tension between the new development and Marcus Washington's family farm. The HOA residents complained about the unsightly farmhouse visible from their neighborhood, the occasional smell from Marcus's compost pile, and the presence of what they considered incompatible rural land use adjacent to their luxury home. Karen Whitman had been elected HOA president on a platform of protecting property values and community standards. A real estate attorney who had moved to Riverside Meadows from the city, Karen had made it clear that she viewed Marcus's property as a threat to the neighborhood's upscale image and had publicly stated her intention to resolve the rural eyesore problem through legal means. Over the years, the HOA had filed numerous complaints with county officials about Marcus's property, claiming violations of zoning laws, environmental regulations, and aesthetic standards. Every complaint had been investigated and dismissed, as Marcus maintained his property in full compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. But Karen Whitman had not given up her campaign to force Marcus off his land. The alleged tax sale that formed the basis of the HOA claim was suspicious from the start. According to the documentation, Marcus had supposedly fallen behind on his property taxes, and the county had sold the land at auction to satisfy the debt. The HOA claimed they had purchased the property for $50,000 at the tax sale, a fraction of its actual value of over $3 million. But Marcus Washington knew the tax sale was fraudulent because he had never missed a property tax payment in his life. He kept meticulous financial records, had copies of every tax payment going back decades, and had never received any notices about delinquent taxes. More importantly, he had been monitoring his property's tax status carefully, specifically, because he had anticipated that someone might try to use fraudulent tax sale proceedings to steal his family's land. What Marcus discovered when he began investigating the alleged tax sale was even worse than simple fraud. Was a systematic conspiracy involving corrupt county officials, fake legal proceedings, and forged documents designed to transfer his property to the HOA through what appeared to be legitimate legal channels. Karen Whitman had apparently used her connections as a real estate attorney to orchestrate the entire scheme, bribing county officials to create fake delinquency records, staging a fraudulent tax sale auction with no public notice, and generating false documentation to support the HOA claimed Marcus's property. But Karen Whitman had made several critical mistakes in her scheme. First, she had assumed that Marcus Washington was just another elderly black man who could be intimidated or confused by complex legal proceedings. Second, she had underestimated Marcus's legal knowledge and his access to resources that would allow him to fight back. And third, she had left a clear paper trail of her fraud that Marcus was about to use to destroy her and everyone who had helped her. Marcus Washington had spent his entire career studying exactly the kind of historical land theft that the HOA was attempting, and he knew every legal remedy available to victims of such fraud. More importantly, he had been quietly preparing for this moment for years, building relationships with federal law enforcement agencies, civil rights organizations, and investigative journalists who specialized in exposing property rights violations. The HOA thought they had successfully stolen 500 acres of valuable land from an elderly black man who wouldn't have the resources to fight back. Instead, they had just declared war on one of the most knowledgeable property rights attorneys in the state, a man who had been waiting decades for the opportunity to demonstrate exactly what happened to people who tried to steal his family's ancestral land. Marcus Washington's investigation into the fraudulent tax sale revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond simple HOA overreach. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to steal valuable land through corruption and legal manipulation. Armed with evidence of the fraud, Marcus began implementing a legal strategy that would not only restore his property rights, but would also expose everyone involved in the scheme. The first phase of Marcus's counterattack began when he filed a federal lawsuit under the Civil Rights Act, claiming that the HOA actions constituted a racially motivated conspiracy to deprive him of his property right. The lawsuit named not only the HOA and Karen Whitman personally, but also the county officials who had participated in the fraudulent tax sale proceedings. But Marcus's real masterstroke was discovering that the HOA had financed their purchase of his alleged property through a special assessment levied against all 200 homes in Riverside Meadows. Each homeowner had been required to pay an additional $250 toward what the HOA described as community land acquisition for enhanced property values and amenities. This discovery gave Marcus the legal opening he had been looking for. Under state law, any property acquired through fraudulent means could be subject to forfeiture, along with any assets used to finance the fraudulent transaction. Since the HOA had used money collected from homeowners to pay for Marcus's stolen land, those homeowners had unknowingly become participants in the fraudulent scheme. Marcus filed additional lawsuits seeking forfeiture of the entire Riverside Meadows development, claiming that since the homes had been used as collateral and funding sources for the fraudulent land acquisition, they were now subject to seizure under state asset forfeiture laws. It was a legal nuclear weapon that put every single homeowner's property at risk. Karen Whitman's response to Marcus's legal offensive was both predictable and self-destructive. Instead of attempting to negotiate or settle the disputes quietly, she doubled down on her fraudulent claims and began a public campaign to discredit Marcus and rally community support for the HOA position. In a series of increasingly desperate public statements, Karen claimed that Marcus was trying to extort money from hardworking families and was using frivolous lawsuits to harass innocent homeowners. She organized protest rallies, started a crowdfunding campaign for legal fees, and gave interviews to local media portraying herself as the victim of what she called reverse discrimination. But every public statement Karen made only provided Marcus with additional evidence of her fraudulent intent and discriminatory motivations. Her comments about Marcus being an outsider, trying to take advantage of our community, were particularly damaging, as they clearly demonstrated the racial animus behind the HOA actions. The situation escalated dramatically when Karen Whitman made the fatal mistake of filing criminal charges against Marcus, claiming that his lawsuits constituted extortion and harassment. She had apparently convinced a corrupt prosecutor to bring charges based on her false claims about Marcus's motivations and legal strategy. But Marcus Washington had anticipated this move as well. He had been working with FBI agents who specialized in public corruption cases, and they had been building their own criminal case against Karen Whitman and her co-conspirators. When Karen tried to have Marcus arrested, the FBI instead arrested her, along with 3 county officials and 2 other HOA board members. The federal criminal charges included conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and racketeering. The evidence was overwhelming: recorded phone conversations, email communications, financial records, and testimony from witnesses who had been approached about participating in the scheme. But Marcus's legal strategy was far from complete. While the criminal cases proceeded through federal court, Marcus continued his civil litigation designed to seize the assets that had been used to finance the fraudulent land acquisition. And those assets included not just the HOA cash reserves, but the actual homes of every resident who had paid the special assessment. The 200 families of Riverside Meadows were about to learn that their dream homes were at risk of seizure because their HOA president had used their money to finance a criminal conspiracy to steal land from a black professor who happened to be one of the most skilled property rights attorneys in the state. Karen Whitman's attempt to steal 500 acres from Marcus Washington was about to cost her and her neighbors everything they owned. The federal arrest of Karen Whitman and her co-conspirators sent shockwaves through Riverside Meadows as residents began to realize the full scope of what their HOA president had done in their name. Local news stations covered the story extensively, with headlines like HOA president arrested in land fraud scheme, and federal charges filed in alleged conspiracy to steal family farm. But the criminal arrests were only the beginning of the residents' problems. Marcus Washington's civil lawsuits were proceeding through the courts with devastating effectiveness, and the legal discovery process was revealing the full extent of the financial exposure facing every homeowner in the development. The special assessment that had been used to finance the fraudulent land purchase was just the tip of the iceberg. Marcus's attorneys had discovered that the HOA had also used the stolen property as collateral for additional loans, had sold development rights to other parcels, and had established a complex web of financial arrangements that put the entire community at risk of forfeiture. Under state asset forfeiture laws, any property used in the commission of a crime or purchased with proceeds from criminal activity could be seized by the government or by victims of the crime. Since every home in Riverside Meadows had been assessed fees that were used to purchase Marcus's stolen land, every home was potentially subject to forfeiture. The legal mechanism that Marcus was using was both brilliant and terrifying in its implications. He wasn't just seeking monetary damages. He was seeking actual ownership of the homes themselves as compensation for the theft of his family's land. And under the law, he had a strong claim to that remedy. The panic among Riverside Meadows residents intensified when Marcus's attorneys filed liens against all 200 properties in the development. The liens effectively prevented any homeowner from selling or refinancing their property until the litigation was resolved, trapping the residents in homes that were losing value daily as the legal proceedings continued. Property values in Riverside Meadows plummeted as potential buyers learned about the legal complications surrounding the development. Homes that had been worth over $1 million were now unsellable, and residents who tried to list their properties found no interested buyers willing to take on the legal risks. The financial pressure on residents was compounded by the fact that their homeowners' insurance policies didn't cover losses resulting from criminal activity by their HOA. The insurance companies denied all claims related to the legal proceedings, leaving residents to pay their own legal fees while facing potential loss of their homes. Several residents attempted to distance themselves from the HOA actions by filing their own lawsuits against Karen Whitman and the HOA board, but Marcus's attorneys argued successfully that the residents had benefited from the fraudulent land acquisition through enhanced property values and improved amenities, making them liable for restitution regardless of their knowledge of the criminal scheme. The media coverage of the story continued to expand as civil rights organizations and property rights advocates highlighted the case as an example of systematic attempts to steal land from African American families. This story attracted national attention, with major news networks sending reporters to cover what was being described as the largest case of HOA-related land theft in American history. Karen Whitman, now out on federal bail and facing potential decades in prison, made increasingly desperate attempts to shift blame onto the county officials who had helped her orchestrate the fraud. But her recorded conversations with co-conspirators, obtained through FBI wiretaps, clearly showed her as the mastermind of the entire scheme. The pressure on Riverside Meadows residents intensified when Marcus Washington announced that he was willing to consider a settlement that would allow residents to keep their homes, but only if they met his conditions. Those conditions included full payment of fair market value for his stolen land $3.2 million, punitive damages of an additional $10 million, and formal acknowledgement by every resident that they had benefited from racially motivated land theft. The settlement offer created divisions within the community, as some residents wanted to accept Marcus's terms to protect their homes, while others insisted on fighting the claims in court. The HOA, now under new leadership after Karen Whitman's arrest, lacked the resources to continue the legal battle and was facing bankruptcy. Meanwhile, Marcus Washington continued living in his family's farmhouse, tending his garden, and watching as the luxury development next door descended into legal and financial chaos. He had turned his grandfather's century-old dream of secure land ownership into a masterclass in legal revenge that was about to cost his enemies everything they owned. The residents of Riverside Meadows were learning the hard way that stealing land from a constitutional law professor was the worst mistake they could have made, and that Marcus Washington's family had not held onto their property for over a century by being easy targets for fraud and intimidation. 18 months after Karen Whitman had nailed the fraudulent eviction notice to Marcus Washington's door, the final phase of his legal revenge was reaching its devastating conclusion. The federal criminal case had resulted in guilty verdicts for all defendants, with Karen Whitman receiving a sentence of 12 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations. But the criminal convictions were only the beginning of the justice that Marcus had orchestrated. The civil asset forfeiture proceedings had been successful beyond even Marcus's expectations, with the federal court ruling that the entire Riverside Meadows development had been tainted by the fraudulent land acquisition and was subject to seizure as proceeds of criminal activity. The court had appointed Marcus Washington as the legal owner of not just his original 500 acres, but also the 200 luxury homes that had been built with money obtained through the fraudulent scheme. In a stunning reversal of fortune, the professor who had been targeted for eviction now owned the entire development that had tried to steal his land. Marcus's first action as the new owner of Riverside Meadows was to offer the residents a choice. They could purchase their homes from him at fair market value, or they could face immediate eviction. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same residents who had supported Karen Whitman's efforts to steal Marcus's family land were now dependent on his mercy to keep their own homes. The financial terms that Marcus offered were generous but firm. Residents who acknowledged their participation in the land theft scheme and formally apologized could purchase their homes for the current market value, which had fallen to approximately $600,000 per property due to the legal complications. Residents who continued to claim innocence or refused to acknowledge wrongdoing faced immediate eviction and forfeiture of their properties. Most residents chose to accept Marcus's terms rather than face homelessness. But several families who had been particularly vocal in supporting Karen Whitman's actions found themselves evicted and their homes seized. Marcus donated those properties to a housing nonprofit that provided affordable housing for low-income families, creating permanent affordable housing in what had once been an exclusive wealthy enclave. The financial settlement also required the establishment of a $5 million fund to support legal aid for other African American families facing similar land theft attempts. The fund was financed through the sale of HOA assets, assessment of additional fees on residents who chose to remain, and Marcus's donation of some of the seized properties. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Marcus's victory was the historical justice he had achieved. The land that his great-grandfather had purchased with steel mill wages in 1923, the land that had been targeted by racist neighbors for decades, was now permanently protected through a conservation easement that prevented future development and preserved it as a memorial to African American land ownership and resistance to theft. Marcus Washington had not only defeated the attempt to steal his family's land, he had turned the tables so completely that the people who had tried to steal from him were now living on his property as his tenants. The professor had delivered a master class in legal strategy that would be studied in law schools for decades to come. The national media coverage of Marcus's victory made him a hero in the civil rights community and a cautionary tale in real estate circles. His story was featured in documentaries, academic papers, and legal textbooks as an example of how knowledge, preparation, and strategic thinking could overcome even sophisticated criminal conspiracies designed to steal African American property. Karen Whitman, serving her federal prison sentence, became a symbol of the consequences that awaited people who tried to use legal systems to perpetrate racial injustice. Her law license was permanently revoked. Her personal assets were seized to pay restitution, and her name became synonymous with corruption and racism in legal circles. 5 years after the initial eviction notice, Marcus Washington continued to live in his grandfather's farmhouse, but now he did so as the owner of one of the largest integrated communities in the county. The former Riverside Meadows had been renamed Washington Acres in honor of his family's century-long fight to maintain their land ownership. The community had been transformed from an exclusive enclave for wealthy white families into a diverse neighborhood where affordable housing existed alongside luxury homes, where the history of African American land ownership was celebrated rather than hidden, and where every resident understood the importance of respecting property rights and racial justice. Marcus Washington had proven that sometimes the best revenge against those who try to steal from you is to legally take everything they own and use it to build something better than what they had destroyed. His victory had not just restored his family's land, it had created a lasting legacy of justice that would protect other families from similar theft attempts for generations to come. The 78-year-old retired professor had shown that knowledge is power, that preparation defeats corruption, and that sometimes the most effective response to systematic injustice is systematic legal warfare that leaves your enemies with nothing but the consequences of their own criminal choices. Have you ever witnessed an HOA abuse their power against a homeowner? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if you believe that attempting to steal someone's family land should result in losing everything you own, hit that share button to support Professor Washington and property rights for all Americans.